Student disappeared from Lisbon hostel in 2008. Voicemail message surfaced in 2024. The morning of September 12, 2008, dawned grey and misty in Salem, Massachusetts. The kind of September morning that made the cobblestone streets glisten with moisture and cast long shadows between the historic buildings. At the Whitmore Inn, a charming bed and breakfast nestled in the heart of Salem's historic district, the day began like any other until it became the day that would haunt everyone involved for the next 16 years. Sarah Michelle Thompson had been staying at the Whitmore Inn for exactly 3 weeks. A 22-year-old architecture student from Ohio State University, she had come to Salem for a semester abroad program drawn by the city's rich colonial architecture and the opportunity to study preservation techniques on buildings that had stood for centuries. Her professors back in Columbus had spoken highly of the program, and Sarah's mother, Carol, had been both proud and nervous about her daughter's first extended time away from home. She was such a sweet girl. Margaret Whitmore, the inn's owner, would later tell investigators, her voice thick with emotion, quiet but not in a shy way, more like thoughtful. She had this way of really looking at things, you know, like she was seeing details the rest of us missed. Sarah had indeed been a careful observer. Every morning, she would emerge from her room on the second floor, room E7, with its view of the courtyard garden, carrying her vintage Canon camera and a small leather satchel. She would greet Margaret with a gentle smile and a soft, "Good morning," before venturing out into Salem's winding streets. Her routine had become as predictable as the church bells that chimed every hour. She would spend her mornings in classes at the Preservation Institute, return to the inn for lunch, and then spend her afternoons wandering the historic district, photographing architectural details that caught her eye. The other guests at the inn had grown fond of Sarah's quiet presence. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a retired librarian from Boston who had been staying at the inn for a historical research project, often saw Sarah in the common areas, carefully organizing her film rolls and making notes in a leather-bound journal. She was so methodical, Eleanor would remember years later, tears in her eyes. Always had her film organized by date, her notes written in the most beautiful handwriting. She reminded me of myself at that age, serious about her studies, but with this underlying joy about learning new things. The inn itself was a character in Sarah's story. Built in 1692, the 3-story colonial building had served various purposes throughout its long history. A private residence, a boarding house for mill workers, and finally, in 1987, Margaret and her late husband Robert had converted it into a bed and breakfast. The building retained much of its original character, wide plank floors that creaked with age, hand-hewn beams, and a narrow servants' staircase that connected the floors. Margaret lived in a small apartment on the ground floor, while the upper floors housed 8 guest rooms. Sarah had been drawn to the inn not just for its historical significance, but for the warmth that Margaret provided. Having lost her own mother when she was young, Margaret had developed a particular fondness for young women traveling alone. She would often invite Sarah to join her for tea in the afternoons, sharing stories about the building's history and the various guests who had stayed there over the years. I think Margaret saw something of herself in Sarah. Robert Henderson, a regular guest who stayed at the inn quarterly for business, would later observe, Margaret had always regretted not having children of her own, and there was something almost maternal in the way she looked after Sarah. Sarah's daily routine had been so consistent that when she didn't return to the inn by 7 o'clock on September 12th, Margaret began to feel a flutter of concern. Sarah always returned by 7, always stopped by the front desk to chat briefly about her day, always asked if there were any messages. When 8 o'clock came and went, Margaret found herself glancing at the front door more frequently. By 9 o'clock, Margaret's concern had deepened into worry. She had tried calling Sarah's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. The automated message, delivered in Sarah's clear, confident voice, seemed to echo with an eerie finality. "Hi, you've reached Sarah. I'm probably out exploring, but leave a message, and I'll get back to you soon." Margaret waited until 11 o'clock before deciding to check Sarah's room. She knocked softly at first, then more insistently. "Sarah, are you in there, dear?" When no response came, she used her master key to enter the room. What she found made her heart sink. Sarah's bed was still made from the morning, her pajamas folded neatly on the pillow, her toiletries arranged precisely on the antique dresser. Everything was exactly as it had been when Sarah left that morning. The other guests at the inn had noticed Sarah's absence as well. Eleanor Hartwell, who had been reading in the common room, mentioned to Margaret that she hadn't seen Sarah come in for dinner. "She always sits at the table by the window," Eleanor said, her voice carrying a note of concern. "I kept looking for her, thinking she might be running late from her photography walk." That night, Margaret barely slept. She found herself listening for the sound of Sarah's footsteps on the stairs, the gentle creak of the old door to room 7, any sign that the young woman had returned safely. But the inn remained quiet, filled only with the settling sounds of a building that had witnessed nearly 3 centuries of human stories. The next morning, when Sarah's bed remained untouched and her absence stretched into its second day, Margaret made the decision to contact the authorities. Her hands trembled as she dialed the Salem Police Department, her voice shaking as she explained the situation to the dispatcher. "I have a young woman staying at my inn who hasn't returned," she said, the words feeling surreal as she spoke them. "She's been missing since yesterday evening. This isn't like her at all." Detective James Morrison arrived at the Whitmore Inn within an hour of Margaret's call. A 20-year veteran of the Salem Police Department, Morrison had handled his share of missing persons cases, though most involved teenagers who had run away from home or adults who had simply decided to start new lives elsewhere. Something about Margaret's demeanor, however, told him this case was different. "Tell me about Sarah," Morrison said, settling into one of the inn's comfortable armchairs as Margaret poured him coffee from the antique silver service she used for special occasions. "What was she like? Did she seem troubled about anything?" Margaret's hands shook slightly as she set down the coffee cup. She was like a daughter to me, Detective. In just 3 weeks, she had become such a part of this place. She wasn't troubled, not in the way you might think. She was focused, passionate about her studies, excited about being here in Salem. She talked about her mother back in Ohio, about her classes, about the photographs she was taking. Morrison took detailed notes as Margaret described Sarah's routine, her habits, her personality. He interviewed Eleanor Hartwell and the other guests, each of whom painted a consistent picture of a young woman who was responsible, reliable, and deeply engaged with her surroundings. She wasn't the type to just disappear, Eleanor insisted, her librarian's instincts making her precise in her recollections. She was methodical about everything. She always told Margaret when she was going out, always said when she expected to be back. For her to just vanish like this, something happened to her. The investigation began in earnest that afternoon. Morrison and his team canvassed the historic district, showing Sarah's photograph to shop owners, tour guides, and street performers. They checked with the Preservation Institute where Sarah had been taking classes, spoke with her professors and classmates, and reviewed her academic records. Dr. Patricia Kendall, Sarah's favorite professor at the Institute, was visibly shaken when she learned of the disappearance. "Sarah was one of my best students," she said, her voice tight with emotion. "She had this incredible eye for detail, this passion for understanding how buildings tell stories. She was working on a project about colonial construction techniques, spending hours photographing joinery details and foundation work. She was supposed to present her findings next week. The investigation revealed that Sarah had been seen on the afternoon of September 12th, walking through the historic district with her camera and small satchel. Several witnesses remembered seeing her near the old burying point, Salem's oldest cemetery, where she had been photographing colonial headstones. The last confirmed sighting was at 6:42 p.m., captured on a security camera outside Hartwell's Market on Chestnut Street. The grainy footage showed Sarah walking alone down the narrow cobblestone street, her camera bag slung over her shoulder, her posture relaxed and unhurried. She appeared to be heading in the direction of the Whitmore Inn, following her usual route home. After that moment, captured in black and white pixels, Sarah Michelle Thompson seemed to vanish from the world. The discovery of the security footage intensified the investigation. Morrison and his team expanded their search radius, interviewing residents along Sarah's usual routes, checking with businesses that might have additional security cameras, and organizing search parties to comb through Salem's parks and wooded areas. Carol Thompson, Sarah's mother, arrived in Salem 3 days after her daughter's disappearance. A single mother who had raised Sarah alone after her husband's death when Sarah was 12, Carol was devastated by the sudden loss of contact with her daughter. She had spoken to Sarah just 2 days before the disappearance, a regular evening call where Sarah had excitedly described her latest photographic discoveries. "She was so happy," Carol said through tears as she sat in the Whitmore Inn's common room, surrounded by the same furniture and atmosphere that had been Sarah's home for 3 weeks. She kept talking about how much she was learning, how the professors were encouraging her to consider graduate school in historic preservation. She had plans, Detective Morrison. She had so many plans. Margaret had insisted that Carol stay at the inn, free of charge, for as long as she needed. The two women, bound by their shared love for Sarah, spent hours together sharing memories and supporting each other through the darkest moments of uncertainty. "Sarah talked about you all the time," Margaret told Carol one evening as they sat in the garden courtyard, the space where Sarah had often spent her mornings reviewing her photographs. "She said you were her inspiration, that you had shown her how to be independent and strong. She was so proud of you for supporting her dreams." This search for Sarah continued for weeks. Volunteers from the Preservation Institute, other guests from the inn, and members of the Salem community joined the official search parties. They combed through the city's parks, explored the waterfront areas, and checked abandoned buildings and construction sites. Local newspapers ran daily updates, and Sarah's photograph appeared on missing persons websites across the country. Despite the intensive efforts, no trace of Sarah was found. Her camera, her satchel, her cell phone, all remained missing. It was as if she had simply walked into the mist of that September evening and never emerged. As the weeks turned into months, the case began to take its toll on everyone involved. Margaret found herself unable to rent out room 7, leaving it exactly as Sarah had left it, as if maintaining the space might somehow bring her back. Carol extended her stay in Salem, unable to return to Ohio, while her daughter remained missing, taking a leave of absence from her job as a high school counselor. Detective Morrison worked the case with a dedication that went beyond his professional duties. Something about Sarah's disappearance had gotten under his skin, perhaps because his own daughter was close to Sarah's age. He spent countless hours reviewing the evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and following up on every lead, no matter how remote. "There had to be something we missed," he would tell his colleagues. "People don't just disappear like this. Not in Salem, not anywhere. Someone saw something, someone knows something." The investigation attracted attention from outside Salem as well. The FBI opened a case file, though without evidence of foul play or kidnapping. Their involvement remained limited. Private investigators hired by Carol's family in Ohio reviewed the evidence independently, but reached the same frustrating conclusion. Sarah Thompson had simply vanished. By December 2008, 3 months after Sarah's disappearance, the active investigation had slowed considerably. The case remained open, but without new leads or evidence. Detective Morrison was forced to acknowledge that the trail had gone cold. The daily searches had ended, the media attention had faded, and the initial urgency had given way to a somber acceptance that Sarah might never be found. The impact on those who had known Sarah was profound and lasting. Margaret struggled with guilt, wondering if she could have done something differently, if she should have been more concerned when Sarah didn't return by 7 o'clock. Carol faced the impossible task of grieving a daughter whose fate remained unknown, caught between hope and despair. "The not knowing is the hardest part," Carol confided to Margaret one evening as they sat in the inn's common room, the fire crackling in the hearth. "If something happened to her, I need to know. If she's gone, I need to be able to say goodbye. But as long as there's no answer, I can't move forward, and I can't let go." The mystery of Sarah's disappearance began to take on a life of its own within Salem's tight-knit community. The historic district, which had always prided itself on being a safe haven for tourists and students, was shaken by the realization that someone could simply vanish without a trace. Parents began calling their children more frequently. Couples walked closer together in the evening, and the casual trust that had characterized the community began to erode. By the spring of 2009, with no new developments in the case, the Salem Police Department officially classified Sarah's disappearance as a cold case. The file remained open, and Detective Morrison continued to review it periodically, but the active investigation had ended. For Carol, this decision felt like a second loss. First her daughter, then the hope that answers might still be found. The Whitmore Inn continued to operate, but the atmosphere had changed. Margaret found herself more protective of her younger guests, more anxious when they were out after dark. She installed additional security cameras and implemented a more formal check-in system, changes that seemed to acknowledge that the world had become a more dangerous place. Room 7 remained empty, a shrine to Sarah's memory that Margaret couldn't bring herself to disturb. Sarah's belongings had been returned to Carol, but the room itself remained exactly as it had been on that September morning when Sarah left for what would be her final photography walk. The years following Sarah's disappearance settled into a rhythm of quiet desperation for those who had known her. The immediate crisis had passed, but the wound remained fresh, a constant reminder of the fragility of safety and the randomness of tragedy. For Carol Thompson, the transition from active searching to passive waiting was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her daughter's disappearance. Carol had returned to Ohio in early 2009, but only physically. Her heart remained in Salem, in the cobblestone streets where Sarah had walked her final day, in the Whitmore Inn where her daughter's presence still seemed to linger. She had arranged for a leave of absence from her position as a high school counselor, unable to face the daily reminders of young people with their whole lives ahead of them, while her own daughter's fate remained unknown. "I kept thinking she might call," Carol would later explain to a grief support group she reluctantly joined. "Every time the phone rang, every time I heard footsteps on the porch, part of me thought it might be Sarah. I knew it was impossible, but hope doesn't follow logic. Hope just exists, even when it hurts." Margaret Whitmore had tried to maintain the inn's operations, but found herself struggling with the weight of memory. Every new guest who walked through the doors reminded her of Sarah's arrival 3 weeks before her disappearance. The common room where they had shared afternoon tea felt too quiet. The garden courtyard, where Sarah had reviewed her photographs, seemed hollow without her gentle presence. "I started having dreams about her," Margaret confided to her sister Ellen during one of their weekly phone calls. Always the same dream: Sarah coming through the front door, smiling, apologizing for being late. She would sit down at the table by the window, the one where she always had her tea, and she would start telling me about her day. But then I would wake up and the silence would hit me all over again. The impact on Salem's small community was subtle but persistent. The historic district, which had always felt like a safe haven, protected by its colonial-era charm and tight-knit community, now carried an undercurrent of unease. Local business owners found themselves more vigilant, more protective of the young tourists and students who still came to explore the city's rich history. Detective Morrison had been promoted to sergeant in 2010, but Sarah's case remained a constant presence in his professional life. He kept a file on his desk, reviewing it periodically, following up on occasional tips that inevitably led nowhere. The case had become personal for him in a way that perhaps wasn't entirely healthy, but he couldn't let it go. "My wife used to ask me why I couldn't just accept that some cases don't get solved," Morrison would later reflect. "She said I was carrying the weight of every unsolved disappearance, that I needed to learn to compartmentalize. But Sarah wasn't just a case number to me. She was a daughter, someone's whole world. I couldn't just file her away and forget." The Preservation Institute, where Sarah had been studying, established a memorial scholarship in her name, awarded annually to a student demonstrating exceptional promise in historic preservation. The gesture was meant to honor Sarah's memory and passion, but for Carol, it felt like a premature obituary for a daughter who might still be alive. "I know they meant well," Carol said during one of her annual visits to Salem, a pilgrimage she had continued every September since Sarah's disappearance. But seeing her name on a plaque, reading about her in the past tense, it felt like everyone had given up hope, except me. The memorial scholarship became a focal point for the community's grief and remembrance. Each year, the award ceremony drew a small crowd of professors, students, and community members who had been touched by Sarah's story. Dr. Patricia Kendall, now retired, attended every ceremony, sharing memories of Sarah's dedication and talent with each new scholarship recipient. Sarah had this way of seeing buildings as storytellers, Dr. Kendall would tell the scholarship recipients. She understood that every beam, every stone, every piece of hardware had a history. She would spend hours documenting details that others might overlook, always searching for the human stories embedded in the architecture. The annual ceremonies became informal gatherings for those who remembered Sarah, a way of keeping her memory alive in the community. Margaret would attend each year, often bringing fresh flowers from the inn's garden. Detective Morrison, even, after his promotion, would stop by when his schedule allowed, maintaining his connection to the case that had defined so much of his career. As the years passed, Sarah's disappearance became woven into Salem's local folklore. Tour guides would sometimes mention the case during their historical walks, describing it as one of the city's modern mysteries. The story would often be embellished in the retelling, gaining dramatic details that strayed from the truth but captured the emotional impact of a young woman's sudden vanishing. It became like a ghost story, Eleanor Hartwell, who had remained in touch with Margaret over the years, observed. People would talk about the missing student, about how she just disappeared one evening, but the details would change depending on who was telling the story. Some said she was seen walking toward the cemetery. Others claimed she was last spotted near the waterfront. The truth became less important than the feeling the story conveyed. The Whitmore Inn adapted to its new reality slowly and painfully. Room 7 remained empty for nearly 2 years before Margaret finally decided to allow guests to stay there again. The decision was both practical and emotional. The inn needed the revenue, but more importantly, Margaret felt that keeping the room as a shrine wasn't honoring Sarah's memory in a healthy way. Sarah would want the room to be used, Margaret reasoned to herself and to Carol during one of their phone conversations. She loved this place, loved the history of it. She wouldn't want her disappearance to turn part of it into a monument to sadness. The first guests to stay in room 7 after the 2-year hiatus were a retired couple from Vermont who had no knowledge of Sarah's story. Margaret found herself watching them more closely than she did other guests, noting how they used the space, whether they seemed comfortable or unsettled. The room itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for some acknowledgement of what had happened there. They seemed perfectly happy, Margaret reported to Carol after the couple's stay. They commented on the beautiful view of the garden, said they slept wonderfully. It was almost normal. For a moment, I could almost pretend that Sarah's disappearance had been a terrible dream. The normality was both a relief and a betrayal. Life was moving forward, as it inevitably does, but the forward movement felt like abandonment. Each day that passed without answers was another day further from the truth, another day that Sarah remained lost to those who loved her. Detective Morrison had been working other cases, of course, but he maintained his habit of reviewing Sarah's file regularly. New techniques in forensic analysis occasionally offered fresh possibilities, but applying them to a case with no physical evidence proved fruitless. The security camera footage had been enhanced multiple times, but it revealed nothing new. The witness statements had been reviewed and re-reviewed, but no new insights emerged. I started to wonder if I was missing something obvious, Morrison admitted to his partner during one of their regular case reviews. Sometimes you can be so close to a case that you can't see the forest for the trees. I brought in fresh eyes, had other detectives review the file, but they all came to the same conclusion. Sarah Thompson walked down Chestnut Street on September 12, 2008, and then disappeared. The missing camera and satchel remained particularly frustrating aspects of the case. If Sarah had been the victim of a random attack, these items would likely have been discarded somewhere in Salem. If she had left voluntarily, she would have taken them with her. The fact that they were never found suggested something more deliberate, more planned, but without additional evidence, these theories remained speculation. Carol's annual visits to Salem became a cornerstone of her grieving process. She would stay at the Whitmore Inn, often in room 7 when it became available again, surrounded by the same atmosphere that had been Sarah's home during her final weeks. These visits were both comforting and torturous, providing a connection to her daughter while emphasizing her absence. I would walk the same streets Sarah walked, Carol explained, to her grief support group. I would sit in the same places, visit the same shops. I was trying to understand her experience, to feel close to her somehow. But I was also torturing myself, imagining what might have happened, wondering if I could somehow solve the mystery that had stumped the police. During one of these visits, in September 2012, Carol met with a private investigator from Boston who had offered to review the case pro bono. The investigator, Michael Chen, had a reputation for solving cold cases and had been moved by Sarah's story. He spent 3 days in Salem reviewing the evidence, re-interviewing witnesses, and walking the routes Sarah had taken. "Your daughter's disappearance is unusual," Chen told Carol during their final meeting. "Most missing persons cases involve people who are struggling with something. Mental health issues, relationship problems, financial troubles. Sarah doesn't fit that profile. She was stable, happy, engaged with her life. That suggests either a random crime, which is statistically unlikely, or something more targeted. Chen's analysis provided no new answers, but it did offer Carol a different perspective on the case. He helped me understand that Sarah's disappearance wasn't my fault, wasn't something I could have prevented, Carol later explained. He said that sometimes bad things happen to good people, and the randomness of it is part of what makes it so hard to solve. The 10th anniversary of Sarah's disappearance in 2018 brought a renewed wave of attention to the case. The Salem Police Department issued a press release asking for any new information, and local media ran retrospective pieces about the unsolved mystery. The Preservation Institute held a special memorial service, and the Whitmore Inn hosted a small gathering for those who had known Sarah. 10 years felt like a milestone, Margaret reflected during the gathering. Not a happy milestone, but a significant one. It was a time to acknowledge that Sarah's disappearance had become part of our stories, part of who we were as a community. We had learned to live with the mystery, but we had never stopped hoping for answers. The memorial service was attended by about 30 people, including Carol, who had flown in from Ohio, Detective Morrison, now a lieutenant, and several of Sarah's former classmates from the Preservation Institute. Dr. Kendall, now in her 70s, delivered a brief eulogy that focused on Sarah's passion for learning and her gentle spirit. Sarah believed that buildings could tell stories, Dr. Kendall said, her voice carrying the weight of a decade's worth of grief. She would have been fascinated by the story that the Whitmore Inn could tell, about the young woman who stayed there, who loved the history and the architecture, who touched so many lives in just 3 weeks. Her story is part of this place now, part of Salem's history. The service ended with a moment of silence, followed by an informal gathering where people shared memories and renewed their connections to Sarah's legacy. For Carol, it was both a celebration of her daughter's life and a reminder of how much time had passed without resolution. I looked around at everyone who had gathered, Carol said, and I realized that Sarah had created a kind of family in her short time here. People who barely knew her had been carrying her memory for 10 years. That was comforting, but it also made me realize how much we had all lost. The gathering concluded with a commitment to continue the memorial scholarship and to maintain Sarah's memory within the community. But as people dispersed that evening, walking the same streets where Sarah had walked her final day, the weight of the unresolved mystery seemed heavier than ever. 10 years is a long time to wait for answers, Detective Morrison said to Carol as they stood outside the Whitmore Inn. But it's not too long to hope. Cases have been solved after longer periods. New evidence can emerge, witnesses can come forward, technology can advance. Sarah's story isn't over. But privately, Morrison was beginning to acknowledge that the case might never be solved. The initial investigation had been thorough, the evidence had been preserved, and the case had been reviewed multiple times by different investigators. Without new information or evidence, the mystery of Sarah Thompson's disappearance seemed destined to remain unsolved. As 2018 turned to 2019, then 2020, the case settled into a new phase of acceptance. The annual memorial scholarships continued. Carol's yearly visits to Salem became routine, and the Whitmore Inn operated normally, with Room 7 hosting guests who might or might not know its history. The immediate crisis had long since passed, but the wound remained, a permanent part of the lives of those who had known Sarah. The COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 disrupted even these established routines. Carol couldn't visit Salem for the first time in 12 years. The memorial service was cancelled, and the inn was closed for several months. The forced isolation seemed to emphasize the distance between the present and that September evening in 2008 when Sarah had walked into the mist and never returned. It felt like the world was forgetting her, Carol said during a video call with Margaret in May 2020. The pandemic made everything feel suspended, like we were all waiting for life to resume. But Sarah's life had been suspended for 12 years already, and no amount of waiting was going to bring her back. The Memorial Scholarship was awarded virtually that year, with Dr. Kendall delivering her annual remembrance speech over Zoom. The technology felt inadequate to capture the emotion and community connection that had marked previous ceremonies, but the commitment to Sarah's memory remained strong. Even in isolation, we carry her story with us, Dr. Kendall said to the small group of screens showing the faces of scholarship committee members, Sarah's family, and community members. Sarah's legacy isn't just in the buildings she photographed or the studies she completed. It's in the connections she made, the love she inspired, and the determination she showed in pursuing her dreams. As 2020 turned to 2021, then 2022, the case remained officially open, but practically cold. Detective Morrison had retired, passing the file to a younger detective who reviewed it conscientiously, but without the personal investment Morrison had maintained. The annual memorial services resumed in person, but the crowds were smaller, the connection to Sarah's story more distant. I started to worry that we were losing her, Margaret confided to her sister during one of their calls. Not just losing the case, but losing Sarah herself. The people who remembered her were getting older, the community was changing, and the new generation didn't have the same connection to her story. The scholarship recipients each year would learn about Sarah's passion for architecture and her mysterious disappearance, but for them it was history rather than lived experience. The emotional weight that had sustained the search for answers was slowly dissipating, replaced by the kind of respectful distance that time inevitably creates. By 2023, 15 years after Sarah's disappearance, the case had settled into a kind of peaceful resignation. The mystery remained unsolved, but the community had learned to live with the questions. Sarah's story had become part of Salem's history, a reminder of loss and love, but no longer a source of active hope for resolution. I never stopped believing that someday we would find answers, Carol said during what had become her traditional September visit to Salem. But I also learned to find peace with the uncertainty. Sarah's life was about more than her disappearance. She was a daughter, a student, a friend. She brought joy to people's lives, and that joy can't be taken away by mystery. The Whitmore Inn had found its own peace as well. Room 7 was no longer avoided or treated as a shrine, but it retained a special significance. Margaret would sometimes share Sarah's story with guests who expressed interest, but she had learned to focus on the positive aspects of Sarah's time there, rather than dwelling on the mystery of her disappearance. Sarah loved this place, Margaret would tell interested guests. She found peace in the history, joy in the architecture, and friendships that lasted long after she was gone. That's what I try to remember now. Not the sadness of her disappearance, but the happiness of her presence. The 15th anniversary memorial service in September 2023 was smaller than in previous years, but no less meaningful. Carol, now in her 60s, had developed a quieter relationship with her grief. Dr. Kendall, now retired for over a decade, continued to attend but spoke less frequently. The scholarship recipient that year was a young woman from California who shared Sarah's passion for historic preservation. "I wish I could have known her," the scholarship recipient said after learning about Sarah's story. "She sounds like someone who really understood the importance of preserving history, of making sure that stories don't get lost. In a way, by keeping her memory alive, you're doing the same thing she was trying to do with her photography." The observation struck Carol. as particularly meaningful. Sarah had been documenting Salem's architectural history, preserving the stories told by buildings that had stood for centuries. In keeping Sarah's memory alive, the community was preserving her story, ensuring that her brief but meaningful presence in Salem would not be forgotten. As the memorial service concluded and people began to disperse, Carol found herself walking the familiar streets of Salem's historic district. The cobblestones that had witnessed Sarah's final steps still gleamed in the September evening light, and the buildings Sarah had photographed still stood as testament to the enduring power of history. She would have loved to see how the preservation work has continued, Carol thought as she passed the institute where Sarah had studied. She would have been proud of the scholarship recipients, excited about the new techniques being developed, passionate about the buildings being saved. The walk concluded at the Whitmore Inn, where Margaret was waiting with tea and the gentle presence that had comforted Carol for 15 years. They sat in the garden courtyard, the same space where Sarah had reviewed her photographs, and watched the evening settle over Salem. "Do you think we'll ever know what happened to her?" Carol asked, a question that had been asked countless times over the years, but never lost its weight. Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "I don't know," she said finally. "But I've learned that not knowing doesn't mean not remembering. Sarah's story is part of us now, part of this place. That's something that can't be taken away." The conversation marked a kind of acceptance that had taken 15 years to develop. The mystery of Sarah's disappearance would likely remain unsolved, but the love and memory she had inspired would continue. The questions would persist, but they no longer dominated the narrative of Sarah's life and legacy. As night fell over, Salem, the historic district, settled into its familiar rhythm. The buildings that had witnessed centuries of human stories continued their silent vigil, keeping their secrets while providing shelter for new generations of visitors and residents. Among those stories, the brief but meaningful presence of Sarah Thompson had found its place, no longer a source of urgent mystery, but a gentle reminder of the preciousness of life and the enduring power of love. The spring of 2024 brought unexpected changes to Salem's historic district. The Whitmore Inn, after 37 years of operation, was undergoing its first major renovation since Margaret had converted it from a private residence. At 73, Margaret had decided that the building needed updates to its plumbing, electrical systems, and guest room amenities to remain competitive in the modern hospitality market. "I kept putting it off," Margaret explained to her contractor, David Walsh, as they surveyed the scope of work needed. "Robert always said that old buildings tell you when they need attention, and I think this one has been trying to tell me for a while now." The renovation was scheduled to take place over several months, with the inn closing to guests for the first time in decades. For Margaret, the decision was both practical and emotional. The building had been her life's work, but she was beginning to think about her future and the inn's legacy. The Preservation Institute had arranged for graduate students to document the renovation process, recognizing it as an opportunity to study the building's historical evolution. Among the student volunteers was Marcus Chen, a 24-year-old architecture student from UC Berkeley who had received a summer fellowship to study colonial construction techniques in New England. Marcus had been drawn to the project not only for its academic value, but because of its connection to Sarah Thompson's story. His research into historical preservation programs had led him to read about the memorial scholarship established in Sarah's name, and he had been moved by the mystery of her disappearance. "I kept thinking about her while I was studying the building," Marcus would later recall. "She had been passionate about the same things I was passionate about: the craftsmanship, the history, the stories embedded in the architecture. It felt like a privilege to be working in the same space where she had lived and studied. The renovation began in earnest in early April, with workers carefully removing layers of paint, updating electrical systems, and reinforcing structural elements. Margaret had insisted that the work be done with sensitivity to the building's historical character, which meant preserving as much of the original fabric as possible while making necessary modernizations. Room 7, Sarah's former room, was scheduled to be renovated last. Margaret had requested this specifically, wanting to ensure that the space would be treated with particular care. When the time came to begin work on the room in mid-April, Margaret found herself emotionally unprepared for the disruption. "I knew it was necessary," she told her sister Ellen over the phone. The room needed new plumbing, new electrical outlets, updated heating, but seeing workers pulling up the floorboards, removing the wallpaper, it felt like we were erasing the last traces of Sarah's presence. Marcus had volunteered to document the renovation of Room 7, understanding its significance to the building's recent history. He photographed each stage of the work, from the removal of the old wooden floors to the exposure of the original hand-hewn beams. His documentation was thorough and respectful, treating the space with the reverence it deserved. It was during the floor removal process that Marcus made the discovery that would change everything. Working with the renovation crew on April 18, 2024, he was photographing the exposed subflooring when he noticed something unusual. One of the wide pine boards beneath the main flooring appeared to have been cut and reinstalled, creating a small access panel that was nearly invisible unless examined closely. "I almost missed it," Marcus would later tell investigators. "The craftsmanship was so good, the cuts were so precise, that it looked like original construction. But when I got down to photograph the joinery details, I could see the difference in the wood grain, the slight variation in the aging patterns." Curiosity drove Marcus to investigate further. Using a small prying tool, he carefully lifted the board section, revealing a shallow cavity that had been created between the floor joists. Inside the cavity, wrapped in what appeared to be a plastic bag, was a small, rectangular object. Marcus's first instinct was to call Margaret immediately. His hands were shaking as he dialed her number, his voice tight with excitement and apprehension as he explained what he had found. "Margaret, you need to come up to room 7 right away," he said. "I found something hidden under the floor. I think it might be important." Margaret arrived within minutes, accompanied by David Walsh and 2 of the renovation workers. The small group gathered around the exposed section of floor, staring at the object that Marcus had discovered but not yet removed from its hiding place. "What is it?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus carefully extracted the object from the cavity, revealing a small memory card wrapped in plastic. The card was old, the kind used in digital cameras in the late 2000s, and despite its years of concealment, it appeared to be in relatively good condition. "It's a camera memory card," Marcus said, his voice filled with wonder. "Someone hid this here, maybe a long time ago." The implications were immediate and overwhelming. Margaret felt her knees grow weak as she considered the possibilities. Could this be connected to Sarah's disappearance? Had Sarah hidden something in the room before she vanished? "We need to call the police," Margaret said, her practical nature asserting itself despite her emotional turmoil. "This could be evidence. We can't just look at it ourselves." The call to the Salem Police Department brought Detective Rachel Santos, who had inherited Sarah's case file when Detective Morrison retired. Santos was a thorough investigator, but she had never expected to see new evidence emerge from a case that had been cold for 16 years. "Tell me exactly how you found this," Santos said to Marcus as she documented the scene. "I need to understand the context, the location, everything about the discovery. Marcus walked Santos through the renovation process, explaining how he had noticed the subtle differences in the floorboard that had led to the discovery. He provided photographs of the cavity, the memory card's position, and the careful way it had been concealed. The hiding place was sophisticated, Santos observed. This wasn't a casual concealment. Someone took time to create this cavity, to hide the memory card in a way that would keep it safe and undetected. This suggests planning, intention. The memory card was taken to the police department's digital forensics lab, where technicians worked to extract its contents. The age of the card and its years of concealment had caused some deterioration, but the lab was able to recover approximately 70% of the stored data. The recovered files included dozens of photographs, most of them architectural details from around Salem's historic district. The images showed the same careful attention to detail that had characterized Sarah's work, the same focus on craftsmanship and historical elements. But mixed among the architectural photographs were images that were far more disturbing. Several photos showed what appeared to be the interior of a basement or cellar, with stone walls and rough wooden beams. The images were dark and grainy, taken with a flash in low-light conditions. Most troubling were the final photographs, which showed what appeared to be an improvised sleeping area, a mattress on the floor, blankets and personal items scattered around. But it was the audio file that stopped everyone cold. The recording was brief, less than a minute long, but its content was devastating. The voice was clearly female, young and filled with terror. "I don't know if anyone will ever find this," the voice said, the words barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'll ever get out of here. She's keeping me down here in the basement. She says she's trying to protect me, but I know that's not true. I know what she really wants." The recording was punctuated by sounds of dripping water and what might have been footsteps above. The voice continued, each word laden with desperation. "She brings me food, talks to me like we're friends, but she won't let me leave. She says the outside world is dangerous, that people are looking for me who want to hurt me. I know she's lying. I know my mom is looking for me. If someone finds this, please don't trust the woman downstairs. She's not what she seems." The recording ended abruptly, leaving everyone who heard it stunned by its implications. The voice analysis would later confirm what everyone suspected. The recording had been made by Sarah Thompson. Detective Santos immediately contacted Carol Thompson, who drove to Salem from Ohio as soon as she received the call. The discovery of the memory card had transformed the case from a cold mystery into an active investigation, and Carol found herself experiencing emotions she hadn't felt in 16 years. "I never stopped believing that someday we would find answers," Carol said through tears as she met with Santos at the police department. "But I never imagined it would be like this. To hear her voice, to know she was trapped and calling for help." The investigation that followed was swift and focused. The audio recording's reference to the woman downstairs immediately directed attention to the inn's staff and residents from 2008. Police records from the original investigation were reviewed, and one name emerged as a person of interest: Elena Vasquez. Elena had been 53 years old in 2008, working as a part-time housekeeper at the Whitmore Inn while living in a small apartment in the building's basement. She had been interviewed during the original investigation, but had provided an alibi for the evening of Sarah's disappearance, claiming to have been visiting her sister in Boston. The original investigation had verified her alibi through phone records and witness statements from her sister's family. But as Detective Santos reviewed the files, she noticed discrepancies that had been overlooked in 2008. Elena's sister had mentioned that Elena had seemed nervous and distracted during her visit and that she had left earlier than usual, around 9 p.m. The timeline doesn't add up, Santos explained to her team. Elena claimed she was in Boston all evening, but her sister's statement suggests she left by 9 p.m. That would have given her time to return to Salem, and it would explain why she seemed nervous during the visit. The investigation into Elena's background revealed a pattern of concerning behavior that had been missed in 2008. Former employers described her as overly attached to young female employees, and there were reports of her following co-workers home and making inappropriate comments about their personal lives. Dr. Patricia Kendall, now in her 70s but still sharp, was re-interviewed about her memories of Elena. She used to linger around the institute, Dr. Kendall recalled. She would come by sometimes, saying she was there to clean, but I would see her watching the students, particularly the young women. I thought it was odd, but I assumed she was just curious about the academic work. The most damning evidence came from Eleanor's former apartment in the inn's basement. The space had been renovated several times since 2008, but architectural plans showed that it had included a small storage room that had been accessed through a concealed door. This storage room had been sealed off during a renovation in 2010, but Detective Santos obtained a warrant to have it opened. Inside the sealed room, forensic investigators found evidence that supported Sarah's recorded account. The space had been fitted with a bed, basic furniture, and provisions for extended occupancy. Most significantly, they found strands of hair and fabric fibers that would later be confirmed through DNA analysis to belong to Sarah Thompson. This was set up as a long-term confinement space, Santos explained to Carol during a briefing. Elena had prepared this room, possibly well before Sarah's disappearance. This suggests premeditation, planning. She had been thinking about doing this for some time. The discovery of the confinement space transformed the investigation from a missing persons case to a homicide investigation. Elena Vasquez, now 69 years old and living in an assisted living facility in western Massachusetts, was arrested on charges of kidnapping and murder. The news of Elena's arrest sent shockwaves through Salem's community. Many residents remembered Elena as a quiet, unremarkable woman who had seemed devoted to her work at the inn. The revelation that she had been capable of such an elaborate deception was deeply disturbing. She was so ordinary, Margaret said during a press conference. She had been working at the inn for 2 years before Sarah arrived. She was reliable, quiet, never caused any problems. I trusted her completely. The idea that she was planning something like this, it's incomprehensible. Elena's arrest brought a mixture of relief and horror to those who had been touched by Sarah's disappearance. The mystery had finally been solved, but the solution was more terrible than anyone had imagined. Sarah had not vanished mysteriously. She had been kidnapped by someone she had trusted, someone who had been living in the same building. The investigation revealed that Elena had become obsessed with Sarah. Shortly after her arrival at the inn, she had apparently interpreted Sarah's polite friendliness as something more significant and had begun to fantasize about protecting her from the outside world. The basement room had been prepared as a place where Elena could keep Sarah safe. In her delusional thinking, Elena believed she was helping Sarah, Detective Santos explained to the media. In her mind, she was protecting a young woman from the dangers of the world. She couldn't understand that what she was doing was wrong, that kidnapping someone and holding them against their will was a crime, not an act of love. The audio recording suggested that Sarah had been kept in the basement room for at least several days, possibly longer. Elena had apparently tried to convince Sarah that she was being protected that remaining hidden was for her own good. But Sarah had recognized the deception and had somehow managed to record the message and hide the memory card. She was incredibly brave, Carol said, her voice filled with pride and heartbreak. Even in that terrible situation, she was thinking about the future, about making sure someone would eventually know what happened to her. She was trying to save other people from going through what we went through. The question of how Sarah had died remained unanswered. Elena's mental state had deteriorated significantly in the years since 2008, and she was found to be incompetent to stand trial. Her memories of the events were fragmented and contradictory, making it impossible to determine the exact circumstances of Sarah's death. We may never know exactly what happened in those final days, Santos admitted. Elena's condition makes it unlikely that we'll get a complete confession or a clear timeline, but we know enough to understand that Sarah was taken against her will, held in that basement room, and that she did not survive the experience. The discovery of Sarah's remains became the investigation's next focus. Elena's fragmented statements suggested that she had buried Sarah somewhere on the inn's property, but the exact location remained unclear. Ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs were brought in to search the building's grounds, focusing on areas that would have been accessible to Eleanor in 2008. The search was methodical and respectful, with Carol's consent and involvement throughout the process. Margaret had temporarily closed the inn during the investigation, understanding that the property needed to be thoroughly examined before normal operations could resume. "I want to know everything," Carol told the investigators. "I want to understand what happened to my daughter, even if it's painful. She deserves to have her story told completely." The investigation also revealed that Elena had taken trophies from her victim. In her current residence, investigators found several items that had belonged to Sarah, including her camera and some of her personal belongings. These items had been carefully preserved, suggesting that Eleanor had maintained her obsession with Sarah even after her death. "She kept these things as reminders," Santos explained. In her mind, she was preserving Sarah's memory. She couldn't understand that what she had done was wrong, that taking someone's life was the ultimate betrayal of the protection she thought she was providing. The community's reaction to Elena's arrest was complex and painful. Many residents felt betrayed by the revelation that someone they had known and trusted had been capable of such deception. The inn, which had been a symbol of hospitality and safety, now carried the weight of Sarah's tragic story. "It changes everything," said Eleanor Hartwell, who had maintained her connection to the inn over the years. "We spent 16 years wondering what happened to Sarah, imagining all sorts of possibilities, but the truth was that she was right there, in the same building where we were looking for her. The person who took her was someone we saw every day." The investigation continued through the summer of 2024, with forensic teams working to piece together the timeline of Sarah's captivity and death. The memory card had provided crucial evidence, but many questions remained unanswered. The exact location of Sarah's remains, the circumstances of her death, and the full extent of Elena's planning all remained mysteries. For Carol, the discovery of the memory card had brought both closure and new grief. The 16 years of not knowing had been replaced by the terrible knowledge of what her daughter had endured. But there was also relief in finally having answers, in knowing that Sarah's disappearance had not been her fault or the result of some random tragedy. "I can finally grieve properly," Carol said during a press conference. "For 16 years, I was suspended between hope and despair. Now I know what happened to my daughter. It's terrible, but it's the truth." And Sarah made sure that the truth would eventually come out. The investigation had revealed Sarah's courage, and determination even in the face of unimaginable terror. The hidden memory card represented her refusal to simply disappear, her insistence that her story would be told. In the end, her own voice had solved the mystery of her disappearance, reaching across 16 years to deliver the justice she had been denied in life. The summer of 2024 brought a strange mixture of closure and renewed anguish to Salem's historic district. The arrest of Elena Vasquez had answered the central question of Sarah Thompson's disappearance, but it had also opened new wounds and forced everyone involved to confront the horrific reality of what had happened within the walls of the Whitmore. In Deirdre, Carol Thompson found herself in the surreal position of finally knowing her daughter's fate while simultaneously grappling with the terrible details of Sarah's final days. The voice recording, which had been Sarah's desperate attempt to leave a message for the future, played continuously in Carol's mind, her daughter's terrified whisper echoing through 16 years of silence. "I listen to it every day," Carol confided to Margaret during one of their many conversations that summer. "I know it's painful, but it's the last thing I'll ever hear from her." In that recording, she's still fighting, still trying to protect other people from what happened to her. "That's the daughter I raised, the woman I'm proud of." Margaret herself was struggling with a complex mixture of emotions. The discovery that Elena had been living in her basement while holding Sarah captive just floors above had shattered her sense of reality. For 16 years, she had grieved for Sarah while unknowingly providing shelter to her killer. "I keep thinking about all the times I spoke to Elena," Margaret told her sister Ellen during one of their evening phone calls. "All the times she helped me with the guests, all the times she seemed so concerned about Sarah's disappearance. She was right there, part of the search, part of the grieving. How could I have been so blind?" The investigation into Elena's background had revealed a lifetime of subtle warning signs that had been overlooked or misinterpreted. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a forensic psychologist brought in to evaluate Elena's mental state, explained that her condition was consistent with what experts call erotomanic delusion, combined with a pathological need to control others. Elena genuinely believed that she was protecting Sarah, Dr. Martinez explained to the investigation team. In her mind, the outside world was dangerous, and she was the only one who could keep Sarah safe. She couldn't understand that kidnapping someone and holding them against their will was wrong. In her delusional thinking, it was an act of love. The psychological evaluation revealed that Elena's obsession with Sarah had begun almost immediately after the young woman's arrival at the inn. Elena had misinterpreted Sarah's polite friendliness as something more significant and had begun to fantasize about their relationship. She had spent weeks preparing the basement room, convinced that she would eventually need to rescue Sarah from some unnamed danger. She had been watching Sarah's routines, learning her schedule, planning for the moment when she would act, Dr. Martinez continued. The evening of September 12th wasn't random. Elena had been waiting for the right opportunity, and Sarah's predictable return time gave her the chance she needed. The investigation had reconstructed the likely sequence of events on that September evening. Elena had waited for Sarah to return from her photography walk, then intercepted her in the inn's hallway before she could reach her room. Exactly how she had managed to overpower Sarah and transport her to the basement remained unclear, but the evidence suggested that Elena had used some form of sedative or drug to incapacitate her victim. Sarah was young and healthy, Detective Santos explained to Carol during one of their briefings. Elena was older and not particularly strong. She would have needed some way to make Sarah compliant, at least initially. We found evidence of sedative medications in Elena's belongings, prescribed for anxiety, but potentially dangerous if misused. The basement, room where Sarah had been held, had been meticulously prepared. Elena had installed a bed, basic furniture, and provisions for extended occupancy. She had also soundproofed the space, which explained why Sarah's cries for help had never been heard by other guests or staff members. Elena had been planning this for weeks, maybe months, Santos continued. The soundproofing alone would have taken considerable time and effort. She had thought through every detail, every possible complication. This wasn't an impulsive act. It was a carefully orchestrated kidnapping. The discovery of the basement room had also revealed the extent of Eleanor's delusions. The space had been decorated with photographs of Sarah, taken without her knowledge during her time at the inn. Elena had apparently been creating a shrine to her victim, building a fantasy relationship that existed only in her mind. She had pictures of Sarah eating breakfast, reading in the common room, walking in the garden, Margaret said, her voice filled with horror. She had been watching Sarah constantly, documenting her life without anyone knowing. It's so violating, so wrong. The investigation had also uncovered evidence that Elena had been intercepting Sarah's communications. Phone records showed that several calls from Carol to Sarah's cell phone had been answered by someone other than Sarah, though the conversations had been brief and unremarkable. Elena had apparently been monitoring Sarah's phone, answering calls when necessary to avoid suspicion. She was trying to create the illusion that Sarah was still free, Santos explained. She would answer the phone, keep conversations short, make excuses for why Sarah couldn't talk longer. It was all part of her plan to keep Sarah's disappearance from being discovered immediately. The audio recording that Sarah had managed to create represented an extraordinary act of courage and determination. Investigators had determined that Sarah had somehow gained access to Elena's digital camera, possibly during one of her captor's absences from the basement. She had managed to record her message and hide the memory card, all while being held in captivity. She was thinking about the future, Carol said during a press conference. Even in that terrible situation, she was thinking about her family, about making sure we would eventually know what happened to her. She was trying to save other people from going through what we went through. The search for Sarah's remains had become the investigation's primary focus as the summer progressed. Elena's mental condition made it impossible to get coherent information about what had happened to Sarah's body, but her fragmented statements suggested that she had buried her victim somewhere on the inn's property. Ground-penetrating radar had been used to survey the entire grounds, focusing on areas that would have been accessible to Elena in 2008. The search was methodical and respectful, with Carol's consent and involvement throughout the process. Margaret had temporarily closed the inn during the investigation, understanding that the property needed to be thoroughly examined. "I want to bring my daughter home," Carol told the search team. "She's been lost for 16 years. She deserves to be laid to rest properly, with dignity." The search had revealed several areas of disturbed soil that matched the time frame of Sarah's disappearance. In late July, investigators focusing on a section of the inn's garden found what they had been looking for. Sarah's remains were discovered in a shallow grave beneath what had been Eleanor's favorite section of the garden, a spot she had tended carefully for years. "She was there the whole time," Margaret said through tears when the discovery was announced. "Every year when we held the memorial service, when we talked about missing her, she was right there in the garden. Elena had been taking care of the flowers above her grave, tending to the space where she had buried her." The discovery of Sarah's remains brought a mixture of relief and fresh grief to everyone involved. For Carol, it meant that her daughter could finally be laid to rest, but it also meant confronting the physical reality of her loss. The forensic examination would provide additional details about Sarah's final days, but it would also be a painful reminder of what had been taken from her. "I can finally say goodbye," Carol said during a press conference. "For 16 years, I couldn't grieve properly because I didn't know what had happened to her. Now I know. It's terrible, but it's the truth." And Sarah made sure that the truth would eventually come out. The forensic examination of Sarah's remains revealed that she had died from asphyxiation, likely after several days in captivity. The exact circumstances remained unclear, but the evidence suggested that her death had not been immediate. She had survived long enough to record her message and hide the memory card, a testament to her strength and determination. "She fought until the end," Dr. Martinez observed. "Even in captivity, even facing someone who claimed to love her but was actually destroying her, she found a way to resist. She left a message for the future, a way to ensure that justice would eventually be served." The investigation had also revealed that Elena had continued to visit Sarah's grave regularly in the years following her death. Garden maintenance records showed that Elena had requested to be responsible for that particular section of the grounds, and she had spent hours there, apparently talking to Sarah's remains as if she were still alive. She maintained the delusion that she was still protecting Sarah, Dr. Martinez explained. In her mind, Sarah was safe in the ground, protected from the dangers of the outside world. She couldn't understand that what she had done was murder, not protection. Elena's trial began in September 2024, exactly 16 years after Sarah's disappearance. Her mental condition had been deemed incompetent for trial initially, but months of treatment had improved her condition sufficiently for the proceedings to continue. The courtroom was packed with community members, media representatives, and those who had been touched by Sarah's story. Carol attended every day of the trial, wanting to hear every detail of what had happened to her daughter. The testimony was difficult, often heartbreaking, but it provided the complete picture of Sarah's final days that she had been seeking for 16 years. "She was brave," Carol said during her victim impact statement. "Even in the face of unimaginable terror, she was thinking about other people, about making sure this couldn't happen to anyone else. She left a message for the future, a way to ensure that justice would eventually be served." Elena's defense team argued that her mental illness had prevented her from understanding the wrongness of her actions. They painted a picture of a woman who had genuinely believed she was protecting Sarah, who had been driven by delusions rather than malice. The prosecution countered that Elena's careful planning and elaborate deception showed clear awareness of wrongdoing. She knew what she was doing was wrong, prosecutor Jennifer Walsh argued. The soundproofing of the basement room, the interception of phone calls, the careful disposal of Sarah's body, these were not the actions of someone who thought they were helping. These were the actions of someone who knew they were committing terrible crimes. The trial concluded with Elena being found guilty of kidnapping and murder, but mentally ill. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, to be served in a secure psychiatric facility. The sentence provided justice for Sarah's death, but it also acknowledged the mental illness that had driven Elena's actions. "It's not the ending I wanted," Carol said after the sentencing. "I wanted Elena to understand what she had done, to acknowledge the pain she had caused, but I also understand that her mental illness made that impossible. What matters is that she can never hurt anyone else." The conclusion of the trial marked the end of a 16-year journey for Carol, Margaret, and everyone else who had been touched by Sarah's disappearance. The mystery had been solved, justice had been served, and Sarah could finally be laid to rest. But the emotional impact of the case would continue to resonate for years to come. Sarah's funeral was held in October 2024, in the same historic district where she had spent her final weeks. The service was attended by hundreds of people, including former classmates, Preservation Institute faculty, and community members who had been touched by her story. The memorial scholarship that had been established in her name was expanded into a full foundation, dedicated to supporting young women in historic preservation. Sarah's legacy isn't just in the terrible way she died, Dr. Kendall said during the eulogy. It's in the passion she showed for learning, the kindness she displayed to everyone she met, and the courage she demonstrated in her final days. She made sure that her story would be told, that justice would eventually be served. The Whitmore Inn faced an uncertain future following the revelation of what had happened within its walls. Margaret, now in her 70s, had decided to sell the property, unable to continue operating a business in the place where Sarah had suffered and died. The building's historical significance remained, but its recent history had forever changed its character. "I can't stay here," Margaret explained to Carol during one of their final conversations at the inn. "Every room, every hallway, every corner of this place reminds me of what happened. I failed to protect Sarah, and I can't live with that knowledge." Carol understood Margaret's decision, but she also recognized the woman's sincere grief and regret. "You didn't fail," Carol told her. "Elena fooled everyone. She was skilled at deception, at maintaining a normal appearance while hiding her true intentions. You gave Sarah a home away from home, a place where she felt safe and loved. That's what I'll remember." The inn was eventually purchased by a non-profit organization dedicated to historic preservation, with plans to convert it into a museum and research center. Sarah's story would become part of the building's official history, a reminder of both the joy and tragedy that had occurred within its walls. "It's fitting," Carol said when she learned of the plans. Sarah loved this building, loved its history. She would be pleased to know that it will continue to serve education and preservation, that other young people will have the opportunity to learn from its stories. As 2024 drew to a close, the community of Salem began the process of healing from the traumatic revelation of Sarah's fate. The case had shattered many assumptions about safety and trust, but it had also demonstrated the power of persistence and the importance of never giving up hope for justice. The memorial service held on the anniversary of Sarah's disappearance that year was different from all the others. Instead of mourning a mystery, the community was celebrating a life and acknowledging the courage Sarah had shown in her final days. The service concluded with the reading of her audio message, her voice carrying across the years to deliver a final message of love and determination. "She never gave up," Carol said during the service. "Even in captivity, even facing someone who claimed to love her but was actually destroying her, she found a way to fight back. She left a message for the future, a way to ensure that justice would eventually be served. That's the daughter I raised, the woman I'm proud of." For Carol, the resolution of Sarah's case marked the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The 16 years of not knowing had been replaced by the terrible knowledge of what her daughter had endured, but also by the certain knowledge that Sarah had never stopped fighting, never stopped trying to protect others from the same fate. It can finally move forward," Carol said during an interview months after the trial. "For 16 years, I was suspended between hope and despair. Now I know what happened to my daughter. It's terrible, but it's the truth, and Sarah made sure that the truth would eventually come out." The case had demonstrated that sometimes the answers we seek are closer than we realize, hidden in plain sight by those we trust most. Sarah's voice, reaching across 16 years of silence, had finally delivered the justice she had been denied in life. Her courage in the face of unimaginable terror had ensured that her story would be told, that her killer would be brought to justice, and that her memory would live on in the hearts of those who loved her. The mystery of Sarah Thompson's disappearance had been solved, but her legacy would endure. The foundation established in her name would continue to support young women in historic preservation, ensuring that her passion for learning and her dedication to preserving the past would inspire future generations. As Salem settled into its new reality, the community had learned valuable lessons about trust, vigilance, and the importance of listening to those who might be in danger. Sarah's final message, delivered through the voice recording that had solved her case, served as a reminder that even in the darkest moments, courage and determination can triumph. The cobblestone streets of Salem's historic district continued to tell their stories, now including the story of a brave young woman who had refused to disappear without a trace. Sarah Thompson's voice had echoed through time, carrying a message of love, courage, and the unbreakable human spirit that endures even in the face of unimaginable adversity. Her story serves as a reminder that every voice matters, that every life has value, and that sometimes the greatest act of love is ensuring that the truth will eventually be revealed. Sarah Thompson may have lost her life, but her voice lived on, delivering justice and peace to those who loved her, and ensuring that her legacy would never be forgotten. A message from the heart. As we reach the end of Sarah's story, we're reminded that behind every mystery, every disappearance, every unsolved case, there's a human being whose life mattered deeply to those who loved them. Sarah Thompson's courage in her final days, her determination to leave a message for the future, shows us that even in our darkest moments, we can choose to fight for truth and justice. This story touches something deep within all of us: the fear of losing someone we love, the power of never giving up hope, and the strength that comes from community and persistence. Sarah's mother, Carol, never stopped believing, never stopped searching, and her faith was ultimately rewarded with answers, however painful they might have been. If this story has moved you, if it has reminded you of the preciousness of life and the importance of holding our loved ones close, please take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, just as Sarah's voice mattered. Every story shared, every memory honored, every act of kindness inspired by these tragic events helps ensure that those we've lost are never truly forgotten. Please consider subscribing to our channel if you haven't already. Together, we can continue to tell these important stories, to seek justice for the forgotten, and to honor the memories of those who can no longer speak for themselves. Your support helps us continue this vital work of bringing light to the darkness, answers to the questions, and peace to the families who need it most. Hit the like button if this story has touched your heart, and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you'll never miss our latest investigations into the mysteries that matter most. Together, we can ensure that every voice is heard, every story is told, and every life is remembered with the dignity and respect it deserves. Thank you for being part of this journey, for caring about Sarah's story, and for helping us keep her memory alive. In a world that can sometimes feel cold and uncaring, your compassion and engagement remind us that humanity still prevails, that love still matters, and that justice, however long it takes, can still be served.